All right, let's begin. Welcome, and thank you all for coming on a Friday afternoon to hear our discussion on Korean comics, or Manhwa, which is also an introduction to a new collection that we're developing of Korean comics specifically in the East Asian Library. I am certainly not an expert on comics or comic books, which is a peculiar English term we have for this genre, which I think is more accurately described by the Chinese character term manga and Japanese mana in Korean, which, as we'll hear from our speaker, has a rather different tradition from that in the West. My only experience with comics, which I admit was a rather prolonged and intimate one, which was being a fanatic collector of superhero comics when I was a child, spending 20 cents of my 25-cent a week allowance every week on the latest Avengers or Spider-Man book, which I could not have imagined in those days, the so-called Silver Age of American comic books would one day become multi-billion-dollar movie franchises. So we're very privileged to have this opportunity to develop, I think, what will be a very distinctive Korean manhwa collection here at Columbia. And we're also very happy to have our postdoctoral fellow, Dima Mironenko, to introduce it to us. Let me first begin with thanking Jim Chung, our redoubtable East Asian librarian, for organizing this and really captaining the East Asian Library for the last several years, helping us to become an even greater East Asian library than we have been in our long tradition there at Columbia. And also Hee-sook Shin, another panelist who is the Korean Studies librarian here at the CV Star East Asian Library, where she has been in residence for the last 12 years, since 2003. Hee-sook has done extraordinary work in building up the Korean language collection here. We now have, I believe, the third largest university collection in Korean language after Harvard and Hawaii. And also, in particular, going beyond the printed word, of which we have all kinds of forms, to building up a very substantial and unique collection of DVDs, film, and audio recordings. Not least, Columbia is privileged to house the Theodore Conant collection of audio and visual recordings from Korea in the 1950s, of which there are many extremely rare film and audio samples that cannot be found anywhere else, including in South Korea. And I would like to introduce very briefly our speaker, Dima Mironenko, who is a postdoctoral fellow affiliated with the Center for Korean Research. He received his PhD from the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard last year, with his dissertation entitled A Jester with Chameleon Faces, Laughter and Comedy in North Korea, 1953 to 1969. Building on theories of everyday life from de Certeau and others, Dima explores with great subtlety and sophistication the forms of humor and the society reflected in them in Korean film, graphic illustrations, and textual forms in North Korea in the 1950s and 1960s. North Korea is not a place that is often associated with humor. And indeed, one of the reviews of the interview last year suggested that Kim Jong-un does not have a sense of humor, which I find absolutely untrue from my knowledge of Kim Jong-un, which is not that great, I admit, but there is humor in North Korea, as of course everywhere else. But what remains our task is to find it, and I think Dima has done a remarkable job of exploring that question in the context of the history of North Korea. So his work examines the emergence of laughing subject in North Korea in contrast to, but also in some ways in cooperation with the state's effort to discipline that humor. Dima was born in the former Soviet Union and received his BA in International Relations from the University of Moscow in 2005. He also spent a semester as an exchange student at Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang in 2000. We are very privileged to have him here with us for a year as he revises his dissertation and pursuing a number of other projects on North Korean cinema and gender history. And we welcome him today to introduce us to the subject of Korean comics. But first, Hee-sook will say a few words about the collection. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As Professor Charles already told that, for many, the reading comic books is a formative childhood experience. But nowadays, the comic books have increasingly become popular not only among children, but also by teens as well as adults. Oops, sorry. So today I would like to talk about the Korean comic collection in the East Asian Library at Columbia. But I would like to briefly talk about the history about Korean comics called Manhwa. And then our collection in terms of acquisition and how to process the acquired materials and how to access the collection. And I conclude my talk. Manhwa, as manga in Japanese and manhwa in Chinese, is the general term for Korean comics and printed cartoon, and it has been used since 1923. And before then, tam 어찌, which means what will come up next, was used before adapting manhwa. And comics in North Korea are usually referred to 그림책. Modern style of manhwa, influenced by the techniques of Western journalism caricature, was started around the early 1900s. And the history of Korean comics can be divided into 4 phases: emergence, development, and renaissance, and new era of manhwa. The first newspapers and periodicals launched in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries in Korea utilized comics. And in 1909, 대한민보 published the Korea's first newspaper comic strip by Lee Do-young titled Sapwa, on the front page of the first issue. And though the Sapwa was not being specifically called manhwa, but it was clearly resembled today's comic, and this is the picture of the sapwa. In 1920s, Kim Dong-sung, who was the first Korean cartoonist, published the A4 box comic strip, while An Seok-ju published a series of 4 strip manhwa in 동아일보. And as a reflection, entertainment comic emerged with 멍텅구리 by No Soo-hyun, become the first entertaining newspaper comic. And the picture to the right was the first cut strip manhwa by Kim Dong-sung, appeared in 동아일보 in 1920. And this manhwa depicts 4 people immersed in a deep reading of the newspapers in different situations, eating breakfast, walking down the street, and getting a haircut and taking care of their baby. But they cannot stop reading the newspaper, as the comic actually was used a way to promote its newspaper. The picture to the left is the An Seok-ju's comic strip, which shows pre-modern and modern style during the period in Korea, and then showing that the fashionista wearing high heels, knee stocking, short skirt with fur coat, but comes out from the thatched roof small house. And the picture to the right illustrates the promotion of gymnastics to the Korean people in order to mobilize them to join the military army. And then as a pro-Japanese, No Soo-hyun promoted Japanese government policies using his comics during the period. As you see, manhwa in this period was published mostly in newspapers and were featured as political and social satires along with the current events in newspapers. And additionally, many children periodicals such as Sebyol and 어린이, which contained comics, were published. And the picture to the left is the one example comic by An Seok-ju, appeared in the children's periodical 어린이 in 1925. However, satirical comics were repressed and censored by the Japanese government, and most of the Korean newspapers and periodicals were forced to close during the late 1920s through 1930s. Though manhwa was developed and published during this era, the publication of manhwa came to a halt until Korea's liberation in 1945. After the Korean independence and the Korean War, the demand of Korean publication increased, bringing a revival in the manhwa industry as well. From the mid-1950s, various comic magazines were published, including Manhwa Segue. This is the picture of the comic magazine Manhwa Segue, which led to the publication of comic books. In this period, various genres of manhwa such as romance, fantasy, science fiction, and sport comics were published. The rental shops called 대본소 or 만화가게 or 만화방, where readers could lend or read comics at a cheap price, were launched in 1958. And this is the picture of one of manhwa bangs. The manhwa bangs played a major role in popularizing manhwa, and manhwa bangs, which spread throughout the country, resulted in the increased demand for manhwa, and thus many cartoonists produced more comic books. The manhwa bangs still exist in Korea today, and these are the modern style of manhwa bangs, and now called book cafe or manhwa cafe. In this era, the popular cartoonists were Kim Yong-wan, who creates Kojubu, and Kim Sung-wan, who draw 고바우 영감, and Kim Sano, Shin Dong-woo, and Park Ki-dang. And this is the one popular comic book, Kojubu, by Kim Yong-hwan. And this is the picture of Life 5 by Kim Sano, and it's the first science fiction published from 1959 to 1962. And this is the picture of 고바우 영감. And this comic was published from 1955 until 2000 in the Korean newspapers. And it was very popular, and then people just read the comic before reading the newspaper articles. And these years marked the renaissance for manhwa in Korea. And one notable thing about manhwa was that the adult comic genres such as 고우영's 임꺽정 and Park Soo-dong's 고인돌 was introduced in the newspapers and magazines and became popular in 1980s. And this is the picture of 임꺽정 by 고우영. Additionally, a lot of comedy comics and romance comics also boomed, and popular cartoonists of comedy comics were Kil Chang-deok and Shin Mun-soo, and cartoonists of the romance comic were Omija and Mineni. And this is the one popular comedy comic, Gobongi by Gil Chang-deok. And another popular comedy comic, Dokkebi Gamtu by Shin Mun-soo, and the pictures to the right are the romance comics by Omija. The big change of adult comics in 1980s were the emergence of long narrative comics known as graphic novels. One popular example of graphic novels was 이연세's 공포의 외인구단, and which were published at 30 volumes, and later on it became the icon of manhwa history in Korea. And 이연세, 이상무, 허영만, 박봉석, 이희재 were the main cartoonists. Near the end of the 1980s, a lot of comic magazines were published, such as 보물섬 and IQ Jump, which led to the comic book market. And these are the all comic magazines published during the period. And Korean manhwa's popularity and variety also became firmly established in the era. Since 2000, the combination of new media such as the internet, mobile technologies, and the recession in the Korean publishing market, printed comic magazines and books have been discontinued or have been transformed into online catalog called Webtoon. And Webtoon is the compound noun web plus cartoon, which is web comics in English. Webtoons formats are episodic comics that deal with everyday life, sports, and essay-based comics. After the successes of Shim Seung-yeon's Papepopo Memories and Kangpul's Sunjong Manhwa, Webtoons have settled as a new mainstream genre and have expanded its reader. And this is the picture of Sunjong Manhwa by Kangpul. Webtoons are provided through portals such as Naver and Daum and personal blog, and these are mostly available for free. And additionally, educational comics for children as well as promotional series of comics has been published increasingly. So main cartoonists in the era are Kangpul, Juomin, and the rest. In July 2014, Naver, which is the top search portal in Korea like Google here, launched the Line Webtoon service, which provides free Line Webtoon translation services for popular webtoons for foreign fans in the United States and worldwide. And this is the website of the service. And currently, there are over 130 publishers publish comic books in Korea, and the three major comic publishers, Daewon-CI, Seoul Munhasa, Haksan Munhasa, combined publish more than 50% the total comic books every year. And webtoons are published and distributed through portal sites such as Naver, Daum, Nate, as well as the cartoonist personal blogs. For North Korean materials, most of graphic novels are published by 금성 청년 출판사, 문학예술 출판사, and 근로단체 출판사. Manhwa collection at Columbia. As a member of the Korean Collection Consortium of North America since 1994, funded by the Korea Foundation, the library has been able to develop the assigned subject areas like popular culture. However, the library has collected Korean manhwa only at a small scale as the interest level and demand in Korean manhwa was low in the past. There was no effort to systematically and thoroughly collect manhwa, but after the Korean wave Hallyu and a renewed interest in Korean movies and K-pop resulted in a growing interest in Korean manhwa. In addition, as a popular culture icon, comic books are receiving more attention from universities as a scholarly medium in literature, art history, and popular culture. Although several libraries heavily collect Japanese comic books, none of the libraries in the United States has collected comprehensively Korean comic books. Thus, I began to purchase manhwa, including animation films, intensively starting in 2008. I did not only collect current materials, but also retrospective materials from both South and North Korea to support research not only on Korean comics, but also Korean culture. As a result, now there are over 1,500 titles of Korean comics and over 50 animation films, monographs, and serials on comics in the collection. To develop the comic collection policies are very important because you should determine what kind of materials should be collected for users. Although subject coverage is as broad as possible, I created selection criteria to selectively collect and purchase comic books. The reasoning behind the selection criteria was to accommodate our limited budget, as well as to screen and filter through manhwa dealing with excess violence, sexual content, and martial art. The selection criteria are the following: the manhwa only by Korean cartoonists, and bestsellers and popular manhwa, and popularity of the cartoonist manhwa, and biographical, political, satirical manhwa, and manhwa which were transformed from different formats such as novels, and manhwa dealing with traditional Korean culture like neshi, and manhwa received good reviews from readers. Once you set a selection criteria, the next step is to start acquiring materials. For the acquisition, I have been using 3 web pages: Kyobo, Aladdin, and Digital Manhwa Gyujangak for selecting materials. I also have been requesting and receiving manhwa lists which are available for purchase from Korean vendors. As for the retrospective materials, I have visited second-hand bookstores which deal with only manhwa during my book buying trips and provided the owner with my profiles. The stores selected and sent only complete sets of comics which met the selection criteria to the vendor I designated, and the vendor sent the new materials as well as retrospective comic books to our library. As for the additionally, because donation helped to build a collection quickly and acquire out-of-print titles, I have been contacting potential donors. And one of my student assistants was the daughter of Lee Sang-moo, who creates a lot of sports comics, such as 내 이름은 독고탁. And she kindly arranged and donated her father's books, including 20 titles and 91 volumes. As for the North Korean comics, we try to acquire as many as possible of the North Korean comic books, including pictorial books, and we have been using one vendor located in Beijing. So far, I have not purchased comics in digital format, but I will consider to purchase them in the future. But I would like to point out that most of Korean comics are published actually limited edition. So I need to place orders as quickly as possible because comic books go out of print so quickly. Providing access to the materials, we create a full level of cataloging record, and most of them require original. And as for the classification number, we have given the call number PN6790.K64 and by title. And subclass PC is being used for 그림 check. I'm often asked by faculty and students whether there is an available list of special materials like DVDs. So I have been assigning a general subject headings which provide a list of the entire comic book collection held in the library. And these are the comic books, strip, and Korea South for South Korean manhwa, and comic books, strips, etc., Korea North for 그림 책. And we also assigned genre headings such as fantasy and romance. And the assigning specific subject headings if needed. So to see the list of our entire comic collection, and you go to our online catalog clear, and then you can just type one of the general subject heading, and then the system displays a list of the comic book collection. But I would like to mention that these general subjects are assigned after 2008. So if you actually want to search the materials actually published before then, you have to search either by title or by author. And all comic books are sent and stored off-site in New Jersey due to the limited space on site. And currently there are no faculty members and students who are doing research on Korean manhwa. Most of the materials are circulating and can be circulating even through interlibrary loan, except for special irreplaceable comics which are available only in the library. And the manhwa collection has increased in circulation. And one of my colleagues 2 years ago told me that the Yeol Gango, which is the still publishing issues, was one of the most circulated books by users at Columbia. Comic books are important source and are cultural product of our time. And comics also provide evidence and interpretation of social change, as well as historical and current events. Thus, comic books are being increasingly used in the language and literature programs, and have also been expanded to the academic discipline for research. Our library has been able to collect Korean comics as part of Korean popular culture with support by the Korea Foundation, and will continue to expand the collection comprehensively. I always welcome your comments and or suggestions which will assist us in improving our collection. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Armstrong, for your kind introduction, and thank you to all the organizers for the opportunity to share some of my work with you today. North Korea remains to be a riddle for us, even though the country has been on the map for nearly 70 years, commanding the attention of pundits, scholars, and politicians today, just as it did when the state was first founded following Korea's liberation from Japan by Soviet and UN forces in August of 1945. Our efforts to make sense of this puzzling society and its culture have led us to probe it from various angles. Yet the central question of our inquiries often continues to focus almost exclusively on the role played by the state and its intentions behind the questionable actions and practices that raise our ire as if the state could stand for the totality of historical experience associated with any given time and place. It is only fairly recently that scholars started showing greater interest in the non-state actors, the ordinary people who live in North Korea, whose presence in our historical narratives had long been rather incidental at best. We have finally begun to wonder how the individual has responded to and coped with the challenges of everyday life in a place like North Korea. We all understand full well that North Korea is much more than its government. It is also much more than its touted system of political and economic autarky, known to us by the indigenous term juche, often translated as self-reliance, that we invariably identify it with. North Korea is first and foremost its people, often forgotten, reduced, or ignored in our accounts and chronicles, and replaced by the allegedly all-powerful state. Even when we look at music, literature, cinema, and art produced in North Korea, all too often we only care to understand the state's goals and motives in creating these cultural products, assuming that that will teach us exactly how the texts, images, and sounds in question were received by the intended consumer. This is also how some of us still try to approach newly available sources, such as North Korean cartoons, which were not available to us before. This kind of reading with the grain is certainly an important part of any analysis, but by itself it is insufficient and can go only so far in unlocking the richness of these materials. A new interest in the little man, the end consumer of any propaganda made in North Korea, has led us away from relying too heavily on official documents and traditional methodologies of interpretation and analysis, as we did in the past, toward placing more faith in new primary sources previously deemed unworthy of our attention and developing new creative strategies for reading them. In my own work, which focuses on the early period of North Korean history, chiefly the 50s and 60s, I have encountered time and again a fascinating paradox when the intended goals of official propaganda end up being at odds with their actual outcomes as a result of various misreadings, deliberate and not, performed by individuals, whether openly or in secret. The problem of chronic misreading becomes even more urgent and pronounced when it comes to materials for children. Throughout the late 50s and early 60s, North Korean artists, writers, and filmmakers struggled to create educational products that would elicit the exact kind of reaction from the target audience they had hoped for, but often with very limited success. In early children's films and animation, for example, it was ironically the negative rather than the positive characters that became the objects of popular love and widespread emulation among the North Korean kids, much to the government's dismay. Research into the child's cognitive development during the 60s enabled the state to tailor its educational products for children to make them somewhat more successful in producing the desired effect in the audience. And yet, there is neither a remedy for nor a guarantee against audience misreadings, and the misreadings did continue. Growing up in the former Soviet Union, I remember how I once came across a Soviet comic book at our neighbor's place. It was a book of black and white cartoons, not unlike the ones you will find in the current collection, telling a story of the hardships, deprivations, and oppression endured by the African-American population in the United States, and offering a vivid portrayal of the history of segregation in the American South. By that time, I had already started elementary school and could follow the fairly simple storyline without much difficulty. While I was aware, even as a child, of the book's blatant political message, what really captivated me and kept glued to its pages was something that we would normally write off as peripheral and unimportant. My eye wandered freely to peruse every minute detail of a strange new world that came alive before me in the cartoons. Everything in it was new, unfamiliar, and quite different from the reality I was used to. It seemed as if the buildings, the fashions, the hairstyles, the mannerisms depicted in the cartoons each had their own, at times much more fascinating story to share, which had nothing to do with the overarching official plot. It was those enticing trajectories that I yearned to explore above all, rather than the course charted for me by the unfree artist. As I dived headlong into this enchanting universe, my only guides were my childish sense of wonder and an insatiable curiosity for the larger world outside my home, my school, and my country. It was in those seemingly incidental compositional details and artistic style, among other minutiae and marginalia, that my wandering eye lingered, and that was where my appetite for the real adventure was finally whetted. Similarly, in one of the scenes of Daniel Gordon's documentary A State of Mind, which follows two North Korean gymnasts through their arduous training for the 2003 Pyongyang mass games, Hyung-soon and her family gather in front of a TV in their living room to watch the broadcast of the event. As their eyes are fixed upon the screen, it is neither the grandeur of the spectacle nor its political meaning that they're also interested in. The reason this North Korean family is excited about the show of national prowess in the first place is because Hyun-soon's mother is in the audience, and it is her that they're trying to spot among hundreds of identically looking individuals. While what Hyun-soon and her parents say on camera throughout this documentary never strays away from the official line, their gaze betrays a strikingly different personal motive. Let's see if your mom looks okay on TV, the girl's father jokes as the three of them start arguing with one another about which one of these is Hyun-soon's mother. It is at that moment that the larger-than-life historical pageant becomes reduced to merely a backdrop for one's family untold story of everyday struggles, hopes, and joys. It is precisely this kind of the eye's journey, never following a predetermined path, that so often falls outside the scope of our analysis, especially when it comes to North Korea. In Metaphors on Vision, a renowned American artist and avant-garde filmmaker, Stan Brakhage, writes about the urgent need to regain our ability to see the world through the child's eye. Imagine an eye unruled by man-made laws of perspective, an eye unprejudiced by compositional logic, an eye which does not respond to the name of everything, but must know each object encountered in life through an adventure of perception. How many colors are there in a field of grass to the crawling baby unaware of green? How many rainbows can light create for the untutored eye? How aware of variations in heat waves can that eye be? Imagine a world alive with incomprehensible objects and shimmering with an endless variety of movement and innumerable gradations of color. Imagine the world before the beginning was the word. Brakhage suggests that even though it may be impossible to actually go back to the innocent vision we possessed as infants, there is a pursuit of knowledge, he insists, foreign to language and founded upon visual communication, demanding a development of the optical mind and dependent upon perception in the original and deepest sense of the word. Brackage's appeal to reawaken our dormant potential and engage with the world outside through an adventure of visual perception, putting our optical mind to use, is both urgent and pertinent as we embark on a journey with the strange and the unfamiliar of the world of North Korean cartoons. In order for these materials to truly open up, one would have to attempt to look at them not through the eyes of the state, the bureaucrat, or the censor, but through the eyes of a factory worker on the verge of physical exhaustion after a day of grueling work, a housewife struggling to make ends meet and keep her family fed and clothed, a student in search of a diversion after a long day of classes and extracurricular duties, through the eyes of motley spectators with dissimilar agendas, biases, interests, and dreams, through the eyes of consumers, unschooled in the laws of formal analysis and often unfamiliar with the broader context of the image they're presented with, and not necessarily always interested in the government's motives in creating these images for them. The more points of view we align our perspective with, the greater their variety, the more overlaid our own vision with this kind of empathetic imagination, the more we can relate to the experience of concrete individuals consuming these materials, and the closer we can get to seeing what they may be seeing rather than what the state would like them to see. Perhaps the greatest limitation of putting too much of our trust in formal analysis is that it not merely reduces all the possible divergent readings to just a meager handful, primarily identified with the point of view of the producer of the image, but that it also insists on a certain reading of the image as one complete whole, which is both serious and correct at the same time, while in reality, that couldn't be further away from the historical truth. It assumes a consumer who always gets the intended message right and who is interested in nothing else other than extracting it. A consumer who consumes the image only through a prescribed orthodox reading of it. If the research I have undertaken can teach us anything, it is that the image comes to life and begins to exert its influence only through the agency of its viewer and no other way. If we focus too much on what the state, which is ultimately behind every official image produced in North Korea, wants the image to say, then we simply miss the whole drama of the state consistently not getting what it seeks to convey. The conventional approach to how we understand visual material coming out of North Korea implies a consumer who invariably reads the image as a whole and gleans every bit of meaning encoded in it without adding anything of her own, and thus affecting no change in the text itself whatsoever through the act of reading. Essentially, it is a passive, rigid, disciplined, and unimaginative consumer, an automaton with hardly anything human left in it, probably more akin to a machine or a robot than any real person any of us may know. The historical evidence I have gathered, however, undermines that mistaken belief. At least throughout the 50s and 60s, the audiovisual content available to an average North Korean in the form of books, journals, cartoons, political posters, movies, and animation got systematically reinvented, and often on the spur of the moment, by playful, mischievous audiences for their own pleasure and entertainment, causing a great deal of dissatisfaction on part of the state. While in the early days, much of that kind of textual poaching was facilitated by a variety of technical problems involved in the production and dissemination of such material, there is strong evidence to suggest that this culture of aesthetic and creative reappropriation by the average reader or moviegoer is in fact an inherent and fundamental element of human nature and can never be completely lost or fully suppressed as long as we retain at least some of our humanity. So if we are to talk about a historically situated North Korean consumer and not some theoretical abstraction, then we must acknowledge the fact that this consumer, just like most of us, is both driven by an intense curiosity for all things new and foreign, especially though they're forbidden for one reason or another, and is at the same time defined by her ability to make sense out of nonsense, and vice versa, nonsense out of sense, in her pursuit of various enjoyments. The history of socialist cartoons in North Korea starts soon after the end of the Second World War, with the appearance of the nation's only specialized satirical journal, Hwasal, Arrow, cartoons from which were frequently featured in other publications across the country throughout the 50s. Modeled on a Soviet satirical journal, Crocodile, Hwasal was continuously published for over a decade, and in its early days it had numerous reprints from its Soviet counterpart. The journal described itself as, quote, the Republic's only satirical cartoon magazine, end quote. The publication started in August of 1946 under the name of Horangi, or Tiger. In January of 1948, the magazine changed its name to Hwasal, Arrow. Hwasal, however, was not the only avenue of bringing satire to the masses. For instance, Choso Chinson, Korean-Soviet Friendship, which was an organ of the Korean-Soviet Friendship Society, had featured cartoons and funny stories for years under its regular satire and humor rubric. Naturally, the materials published in Choso Chinson were reprints from Soviet periodicals such as Crocodile, Literaturная Gazeta, Ogonyok, and others. All cartoons featured by the North Korean periodical press at the time belonged either to the category of social satire, deriding old beliefs and customs, or political satire, directed at South Korea, the United States, and other capitalist countries. Hwasal, along with other periodicals that regularly featured humor and satire on their pages, played a crucial role in the formation of a satirical outlook among their readers, by virtue of giving the quotidian a deliberately comical twist. Interestingly, looking at these publications, we encounter frequent representations of contemporary daily life in North Korea. While it was not uncommon to see idealized images of North Korean society, every now and then it was mostly social satire exposing the shortcomings and vestiges of old mentality and practices among the North Korean people. While the purpose of those portrayals was admittedly to make readers laugh at their own shortcomings and character flaws, and in that way rectify them through corrective laughter, we cannot know with certainty whether that goal was ever achieved. In the very least, I would argue, visual satire contributed to bringing play and a playful sensibility along with it into the public realm, and further encouraged, if unwittingly, what I have called elsewhere the practice of street jesting. The 1950s street culture was a product of the social perturbations that engulfed North Korea in the post-liberation period, as well as the social displacements experienced by the people during the Korean War. The new post-war reality is perhaps best characterized by the word that became too common throughout the 50s and that can be encountered across a variety of writings from the period, 무질서, disorder or public chaos. The social disorder was a result of low literacy of the population, breakdown of traditional social bonds when peasants began to migrate into larger cities from the countryside, and a lack of urban infrastructure to direct the energies of people at leisure into organized cultural activities. To put it simply, the masses had to entertain themselves the best way they could, and to do so in the midst of dire post-war poverty and only rudimentary entertainment options available to them by the state. To a certain extent, the North Korean satirical journal was complicit not only in the creation of a jesting culture at large, but also in giving its unintended blessing to the unruly jester himself, the quintessential poacher and misreader of all official texts. That was possible, among other factors, through the journal's sustained efforts to draw its readership into the process of satirizing contemporary everyday life. Hwasal did so by soliciting contributions of all kinds from its readers, including criticism and cartoons, as well as any material on individuals or events that needed to be exposed and criticized, which the editorial board could use in the production of satire. In other words, the nation's #1 satirical magazine did not merely package the everyday as funny and expect its readers to passively consume those representations, but actually invited them to become active participants in the very act of turning the everyday into satire. This, of course, involved not only the ability to identify events and personalities from everyday life that would work well as satire, but also required the necessary skills to produce such representations. In its pursuit of higher production levels across the industries, the state mandated factories and farms to actively involve the working masses in workplace political education and propaganda campaigns. Specifically, workers and farmers were asked to publicize any instances of workplace negligence and mistakes through their locally produced newspapers and wall gazettes, or pyeokbo. Wall gazettes had already been commonly used in the Soviet Union for years, where they were called Stengazeta, an abbreviation of Stenaya Gazeta, a wall newspaper, and from which the Korean counterpart pyeokbo seems to be derived. Stengazetas were essentially collaboratively produced community bulletins placed on interior or exterior walls, featuring local and national news, official announcement, short articles, interviews, entertainment content, as well as pictures, photographs, and of course, cartoons. In order to equip its readers with the skills necessary for the production of their own pyeokbo, Hwasal ran a series of articles in the 50s with detailed instructions on how to make effective cartoons for workplace wall gazettes. The journal introduced its readers to various cartoon production tricks, such as effective use of coloring techniques and detail, which could be easily employed by anyone to create quality materials for office use. pyeokbo also widely used cartoons printed in Hwasal and other periodicals, in addition to creating original artwork. In short, the satirical journal both recorded the comical episodes from everyday life on its pages and promoted a playful sensibility among its readers through getting them involved in the satire production process itself. However, these efforts did not always yield desired results, as the social satire would often play into the hands of street jesters, making them time and again the new heroes of popular cartoons. Street play would ordinarily happen in public spaces, such as bus stops and trains, riverbanks and water pumps, parks and playgrounds. These were busy public sites with enough room for improvisation and enough audience for potential jesters to play their pranks. For a while, Hwasal ran a special section called Rogemshil Recording Studio in almost every issue of the journal, documenting instances of disorderly public behavior in the form of satirical cartoons. The story at times even identified specific places where reported incidents had occurred, belying the state's panoptic gaze extending far into the public realm. Thus, one report humorously records a new type of handshake that has become popular among rush hour commuters. When a person would recognize a certain Park or Kim standing at the front of the line and proceed to greet and shake hands with a newly discovered acquaintance. This in turn would provoke others waiting in line to follow suit, causing a line to turn into a chaotic crowd of people fighting their way to get on the bus before others. Instances of social disorder covered a wide range of mischievous activities, of which we find numerous reports in the pages of Hwasal, as well as other periodicals, not all of them peddling satire. The most common of them included attempts to get on public transportation without paying fare, various pretenses that would get one into a movie theater without having to buy a ticket, street games that often resulted in damage to public and private property, scuffles, brawls, arguments, and the list goes on and on and on. This disorderly behavior encompassed instances of both deliberate mischief and forced survival tactics, while the agents of these acts could be either self-conscious jesters or innocent public inadvertently drawn into an impromptu street incident. As the Soviet Union embarked on the process of de-Stalinization at home in the mid-50s following the Soviet leader's death and tried to implement the same policies abroad in its client states, it brought the foreign public in close contact with a rich body of satire, both contemporary and classic. The impact of this campaign on the North Korean society at large was profound as much as it was unexpected in its outcome. A call for an all-out satirical offensive was not too enthusiastically embraced by professional writers, but found a welcome audience with ordinary people who were also invited to contribute and participate in the nationwide process of satire making. The working masses took to the new trend, finding in it the justification for their own pranks and antics, much to the chagrin of cultural officials, as these unofficial productions and performances very soon began to take the authors far outside the boundaries set by the new government policy. So if that was indeed the case, were then the producers and the consumers of these early cartoons seeing the same thing? Sure enough, both were looking at the same image, but from very different vantage points. Both were actively creating their own interpretations, but coming to them from their respective places. What was public disorder to some was merely a carnival to others, and what was an announcement on the production end could easily become a celebration on the reception end. Playful semantic reversals, shifts of focus and emphasis, fragmentation of the whole, decontextualization of detail, and substitution of official narratives with running personal commentary were only some of the widely used techniques employed by undisciplined consumers of state-sponsored propaganda, which frustrated the government's plans to interpolate a conformist socialist subject. In conclusion, as we explore the treasures of the Manhwa collection housed at the Columbia University Library, in order to truly immerse ourselves in the world of North Korean cartoons, or any cartoons for that matter, we must unlearn what we've been taught and learn instead to read against the grain, with millions of other readers who came before and who will come again after us. Read without the straitjacket of any constraints placed in our imagination, giving free rein to our natural curiosity and indulging the lust of the eye, unfettered by what others might want us to see, guided only by our own optical mind, as Brakhage suggests, and the spirit of playful misreading characteristic of the mischievous post-war North Korean public. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dima. So I think we would just open up the floor to questions or comments to Dima or to Hee-sook about the collection.
Hi, I have two questions for Ms. Chen. Thank you very much for your introduction of this wonderful rich collection at Columbia. So you mentioned that the collection, Korean Studies collection, also include 50 animation.
That's
Right,
right.
and then I was wondering, I think, especially like in the 60s and 70s, probably like from then on, Korea was really, I think, famous for sort of being outsourced Japanese animation, like TV animation. And then, but on the other hand, also like Korea has this really like entertaining children TV animation series. I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the robot, like which is like operated by
Taekwondo.
Yes, which I really like. But anyway, so my question is like, do you, is your collection? I mean, does your collection include this kind of TV animation series? And the second is another like sort of factual question, which is about 1980s sports manhwa. I think you said there was a change in the 1980s, and then I sort of saw that like 1950s super comic kind of manhwa to like in the 60s gekiga, like that I saw that man's sort of realistic portrayal of man's on the cover of magazine, and then like in the 80s you sort of showed a group of, I think, baseball players, actually, the illustration. So, like, I wonder the change, which sort of you that you represented by this sort of the emergence of sports manhwa. What kind of sports manhwa do you have? Like, and also like, do you have kind of titles catering to boys, or like, do you have also like sports manhwa catering to girls?
For the first question, unfortunately, there aren't many actually TV dramas. The comic dramas are not available to purchase. So I didn't purchase much about those the TV dramas comics. But we tried to. I purchased. I mean the materials which converted to DVDs from mostly 2000. So the collection we have are mostly published, I mean, after 2000, before 1990s and 2000. So, and for the second question, a lot of sports comics are based on baseball and the football because those sports are very popular in Korea. So most of actually those two sports are actually based on the comics. And I haven't seen actually the sports comics related to girls. So I cannot answer that question. Yeah.
I wonder, Dima, also perhaps Hee-sook, I wonder if you can answer my question about, which is coming from someone who's certainly no expert in this, but it seems to me that there is a transnational element to the history of comic books, which somehow just focusing on a national production kind of leaves out. And I'm curious, seeing how much influence or sort of exchange there was in what's going on in Japan, in the case of South Korea. And you talked about outsourcing animation to South Korea, but of course, of Japanese animation, but also the U.S. has done this a lot. And, The Simpsons was mostly made by Korean cartoonists, for example. There's actually a very funny parody of that in The Simpsons. But anyway, and in the case of North Korea, I wonder, in addition to the Soviet Union, are there all kinds of sort of interactions with other countries, including maybe even at a certain level Japan in the production of North Korean cartoons?
So the transnational element is definitely present, not only in the early period, as I referenced earlier, but also more recently, if we look probably from sometime in the 90s up to the present day. The late 50s, actually starting from the late 40s into the early 60s, the Soviet Union was not the only source of satire, both in the form of cartoons and translated text that was coming into the country. But there were also quite a few from other socialist countries, especially Czechoslovakia, Eastern Germany, etc. So we find reprints of that in the satirical cartoon magazine. But there's also interest since the early 60s in Czechoslovakian animation. And actually, kind of up till that point, cartoons in North Korea are not regarded as something produced specifically for children. Yeah, the goal is to produce this political social satire targeting mostly adults, but then it kind of starts to specialize on children audiences, on different age groups, and kind of cater to that. And so starting its own animation production is part of this process of kind of specializing and developing a form that suits the taste and the abilities of a younger audience. What's interesting when we get into the 90s, as a lot of changes with North Korea, there's a very noticeable influence of Japanese animation. And I noticed that for the first time when I was writing my master's thesis, which was on North Korean animation. I was focusing mostly on the 80s and 90s, and I was looking through a few long-running animation series, counting about 200 episodes, that somewhere toward the end, the aesthetic changed from a very clearly Soviet-influenced aesthetic of animation films to something that looked very much like anime. And later on, when I taught for an anime class at Harvard, I really came to see that even more, and kind of to gather more support for that initial observation. And I think actually looking at some of the books in the collection from 2000s at Columbia University, I also noticed that some of the comic books have a markedly different style. So there's definitely this transnational element present. It's hard to say, though, in between the period of early North Korean history and more contemporary history, what's going on. Part of the difficulty of saying that with any certainty is that a lot of the materials that we have to work with, for example, in my case, Hwasal, I was able to locate in Russian archives, and they don't seem to have many materials after the mid-60s, when the relations between North Korea and the Soviet Union soured, and then until the 80s. So I think it will take some time for us to account for this intervening few decades what really happened. But I wouldn't be surprised that on some level that transnational exchange was continuing.
Actually, I didn't actually study deeply, about the animation films, and then also, but I don't know whether this answer to your question is that because actually our animation industry are influenced from Japan and from the United States, and then our animation industry has declined, and then there are 1960s and 70s, and there many the film product companies actually are bankrupt, because actually the people try to just import the Japanese films and just show in the at the television, and also the same as we import the films from United States and just showing at the television stations. So the animation films produced by Korean producers are just getting declined, and even these days also there aren't many animation films available to purchase. So.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a question. Thank you very much for your very rich introduction to our collection. Perhaps my question is also related to the history of transnational element. I'm interested in learning more about the historical origin of the term manhwa. Manhwa sounds to me, as you just showed, is probably shared by the three countries. In Korea, it's a Sino-Korean manhwa, Japanese manhwa, and Chinese manhwa. And we also talked about the Taomonji. That was used before manhwas.
Describe.
Yeah, so I'm curious about the reference of Taomonji. When was it used and where did you find it from? And why is the reason that the term manhwa replaced the Taomonji, which perhaps was used from the previous?
We have several books about the history of Korean manhwa, and then I found Taomonji from the books when I prepared this presentation. So I don't know which book, but I will check and then we'll let you know.
Yes, John.
I just have a simple question. I was just wondering, stylistically, what's uniquely North Korean manhwa or South Korean manhwa?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure that you can pinpoint a certain formal element to call a particular representation North Korean per se. Actually, which is even more interesting is that when you look at the cartoons from the 50s and 60s, although many of them are produced by North Korean artists, someone pointed out to me that the characters all look Western, they look Caucasian, and why is that? I mean, that's a really good question. I don't have a definite answer for it, but that seems to be also, I talked with some colleagues, not just unique to North Korea and South Korea kind of at the same time. So I think it very much has to do with kind of the orientation of artists, where they're looking to, who are looking at, what they're trying to, emulate, learn from, build on, etc. There's also kind of this, I guess, interest and fascination that period with the West. I mean, that may be a factor as well. So really, in North Korean cartoons, if I took out Korean out of it, it would be hard to necessarily say if they're Soviet cartoons, East German, Czech cartoons, or North Korean cartoons. Although over time, some national specificity starts to appear, and that has to do kind of with the change in the political situation, with the rise of Juche ideology and kind of the drive to introduce national elements as much as possible. In music, for example, in films, like even in comedy films that they're making in the 60s, they want to develop a distinctly Korean music that they play in all comedy films, and composers and musicians who are working on all that were really perplexed. But what exactly are we going to do, because that music doesn't really work with the conventions of comedy, what we're trying to develop. But that was kind of the political requirement that they had to work with, and I think we really need to look at a longer period, kind of to see how that changes over time. But definitely, like some kind of superficial elements such as dress, even the features, facial features start looking more, having more national specificity. Characters start looking more Asian. I think even in some of the cartoons that I showed from that period, but more consistently so, and also in animation. Dress, kind of the setting. As far as the humor itself goes, I mean, it's a whole separate question, and I'll stop at this.
I had a question back there. Yes.
Okay, my question is to Dima. The talk was very interesting. I really interested in the history of North Korean cartoon. I have a question about your title. When you say early North Korean cartoons, which period you are referring to? I'm asking this because in the history of Japanese political cartoons, usually earlier influence coming from the European countries, especially French, and also British humor magazine in the late 19th century. Then, considering all the colonial history in Japan, to the Korean peninsula, you might be able to excavate much earlier history of political cartoons.
Well, of course, it doesn't just start in the 50s, and there's a much longer history going to pre-modern period. But I think an important question is what do North Korean government, North Korean society consciously associate themselves with, and what do they distance themselves with, what kind of legacy? And although there was a rich history of native cartoon production in the modern period as well, as Hee-sook has introduced, and I read about that in the dissertation as well, to some extent, that didn't really have any much continuation, as most things that had to do with colonial period in North Korea. North Korea was very consciously trying to kind of undo all that and build a new society. So a lot of the initial impulses, at least in the late 40s, early 50s, comes from the Soviet Union. And up to the late 50s, North Korea doesn't have much choice, as to what it wants to follow and how. But as the Soviet Union starts heading in a different course, kind of the so-called thaw starts in the Soviet Union. North Korea starts taking less and less cue from Soviet directives. But a turning point here is the Second Congress of Soviet Writers in mid-50s that really brought satire back on the agenda. Satire flourished in the Soviet Union, and I mean a lot of it that appears in the early issues of Hwasal, for example, kind of goes back to the period. So it flourished in the 20s, but when Stalin comes to power, it becomes increasingly dangerous to produce satire, to laugh, especially, political satire. So that kind of fizzes out pretty quickly, and not until after Stalin's death that the cultural establishment decides to bring that satire back. And so by way of the Soviet Union, North Korea, along with other countries in Eastern Europe, get kind of that influx of Soviet satire. But the Soviet Union was also bringing not just Soviet and Russian satire, but a lot of translated Western satire that was acceptable and approved and already part of the so-called socialist canon that was being put together. So, for example, when I was working through Russian archives and some archives in South Korea and at Harvard, I came across North Korean translations, new translations that were translated before, but new North Korean translations of Mark Twain, Jonathan Swift, some English humorists, etc. So that was circulating there at the same time, but something that kind of went through this preliminary screening already. And of course, we should not forget, I was talking about the human element in reading, and that we should always be conscious of it, and we shouldn't forget, of course, that the producers of those images and the cultural authorities were there were people, and many of them lived through the colonial period, and so even if that's something that maybe not manifest openly, that influence is brought into the equation as well. So there's a lot of going at work, and it's kind of this painstaking process of separating every thread and kind of seeing where they lead all together.
Yeah, one last question, or maybe two. Why don't you both ask your question, then we'll end. Yes.
Okay, so I actually have two questions for Dima. First one, you mentioned earlier in your talk that there were some cartoon characters which are supposed to be bad guys, but somehow they were the popular ones. So I wonder if you could maybe give us one example of that. And second question about this satirical cartoons. I'm wondering, this once you showed us, they are, to me, it seems easiest to read them as basically a disciplinary tool because they are critiquing particular behavior of regular people. To read it more as some kind of satirical engagement with power, with some kind of subversive text, I would want to see something that it is actually attacking someone in some kind of position of power. So my question is, are there actually any examples of that, or are those satirical arrows targeting just, common people who jump lines and things like that?
Okay, why don't we take the last question then?
It's also for Dima. I think it seems like you're doing very important work with reading the sources against sort of the state production model. And I had maybe a question about the methodological approach, and maybe you could say something about the challenges of trying to read the reception of these comics. And I'm just ignorant of the sources. If you can say more about how you what you can say about whether there are writing about people talking about how they're reading these, or where you're finding evidence that obviously some of these comics are being produced by the workers themselves. I was wondering what other material you have.
Okay, great. Thank you for your questions. So I'll answer them in order. So as far as the example about negative characters being more popular with children audiences than positive characters, that's actually something that comes up during the first productions of live action and animation films for children that come out in the late 50s, early 60s. And so one example that I came across is that, one of the negative characters was, a Japanese person during the colonial period, and so to make the negative character, the problem with negative characters is that they were made funny, and using that humor actually won the affection of the audience. So there, for example, they were making fun of the Japanese accent, speaking Korean, and there were reports of kids starting playing, instead of emulating. I mean, that was the purpose of all these productions, is, to make kids follow certain ways and not do certain things, and one of the things that would start pretending to be Japanese, speaking with an accent, doing some other things, and that raised an important question of how do we use humor. We use humor kind of to deride negative characters, whereas this positive character is also ideal and good and and boring and just bland, and that doesn't work definitely for kids. They don't pick on that. They're just bored and they lose their attention. So that's what was going on. So it has to do with comicalizing those representations, through accents, through some kind of artistic exaggerations and whatnot. As far as examples of attacking the government or authorities, rather than just kind of representing the.
Not to mention so much government, but maybe some kind of local level.
Yeah. So that we can see in some examples. I didn't provide examples of the actual Pyeokpo, the wall gazettes, but these were that provided the opportunity for North Korean people to bring their grievances to public view and discussion. So often there are examples, and Hwasal ran regular contests, so they will solicit those submissions. And it's like the New Yorker, add your caption to the cartoon kind of contest. But some of them were actually produced from scratch, and many of them showed somebody in a position of power, mismanaging or being negligent at work, or misappropriating funds, all these kind of problems were reported. And that's the state kind of, I think it's also, it created a lot of problems, which is a separate story, but for the state it was a way to track down what was going on the ground where they necessarily could not reach out themselves. So kind of calling on people, I guess, to, if not spy per se, but, report in that form, in that manner, what's going on. And they appealed with the same request to official writers and artists, and that didn't go that well. So the hired, paid staff who had to produce satire were not very excited about putting somebody down, criticizing, finding all these things, because they realized how that it could affect them. But kind of people, an average worker in a factory probably didn't think too much before they put out something like that, which might have got them in trouble, but that was kind of learning through trial and error. Then I'll move on to the second, to the other question about the reception. Well, one way to kind of trace how those, and my work is mostly with film, and so when I was going in the movie theater, the state could follow through an army of its undercover agents, if you could say so, basically officials, inspectors, if you will, who had to make regular tours of movie theaters in the cities, but also in the countryside, that was mostly taken care of by mobile projection units, just to see, if the policies were executed properly, if they were showing the right films, and they had accompanying explanatory lectures and discussions, and if everything was going great, and it was not. And so we see a lot of these reports. Some of them, also take a humorous form, but not necessarily, and they're not all published in humorous or satirical outlets per se. But of course, another, in addition to those representatives of the film industry going and checking movie theaters and distributors and exhibitors on the audiences, what's going on, and reporting all sorts of oversights, problems. Such problems as, for example, admitting kids to any show, even if it was not meant for the kids, and just completely kind of caring more about filling the movie theater than following the letter of rules and regulations they had to follow. And so on and so forth. But there are also letters coming from people, of course, they're screened and selected and censored to, what ends up being published, but, that gives us some glimpse also of how some people were experiencing. We have to be very careful how we read that, what we can get out of it, but we can get something out of it. And it's the whole process of reconstruction as far as early North Korean history goes, but also contemporary is kind of this process of distilling, as much as you can from this, layers and layers of veils, official veils. So yeah, this is kind of a few methodological ways that I could.
Okay, great. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Dima.